Hello everyone, and welcome to our video all about iron and zinc. So iron and zinc are both minerals found in a variety of plant and animal-based foods. Now iron is important for oxygen transport to the cells, energy production in the electron transport chain if you're a biochemistry nerd, growth and DNA replication. And zinc is important for immune function, gene expression, and is a cofactor, meaning it plays an essential role in many chemical reactions in the body. So why do we focus on zinc in infancy? Well, the content of iron and zinc in human breast milk declines over the first 6 months of breastfeeding to the point where breast milk is inadequate to provide iron and zinc to baby by the time they hit 6 months. Now, because breast milk is inadequate in these nutrients, we've got to provide some other source of iron and zinc, and that comes from solid foods. Now, if you're feeding your baby infant formula, many infant formulas are fortified with iron and zinc, but it's still important to focus on these nutrients during the starting solids period because they're so important for growth and immune function. Now, a really cool little tidbit about minerals and many vitamins is that feeding your baby normal amounts of foods rich in certain vitamins and minerals is not going to result in any sort of toxicity from these nutrients, assuming that there's no underlying medical issues. So moving forward, we were going to talk about emphasizing iron and zinc rich foods in your baby's diet, but you don't need to stress about your baby getting too much iron or zinc from whole foods. So let's go through some sources here. Now, the sources of zinc are very similar to the sources of iron, which is why I decided to combine this into one video. Some zinc-rich foods include things like oysters, crab meat, turkey, red meat is a great source of zinc, chicken, nuts and seeds, yogurt and cheese, chickpeas, nuts, beans, and fortified grains. Now, moving on to iron, I'm going to break that up into two different groups. So iron coming from animals and iron coming from plants. Now, some sources of iron that come from animal foods are beef and pork, liver, and other organ meats. Those are great sources of iron. Clams and oysters, chicken and turkey, eggs, and then fish also has some iron, although it's not the best source. So I want to point something out here. Note that that list didn't include any dairy products, and we'll talk more about why that is in a little bit. So now let's move on to some plant sources of iron. So plant sources of iron include dark leafy greens, and you want to cook them because there are some compounds in raw leafy greens that can inhibit iron absorption. So steaming does the trick there. Black beans, peas, whole grains, lentils, soybeans, and tofus can be a good source of iron, although tofu might not be the greatest source due to its phytic acid content. Potatoes are a good source of iron, quinoa, nuts, seeds, and fortified grains. Those are all great sources of iron that come from plants. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about why I differentiated this into two groups. So I'm going to pause here and give you a light chemistry lesson that is directly relevant to feeding your baby, especially if you're raising a plant-based baby. So there's two types of iron, heme iron and non-heme iron. Now, heme iron, think hemoglobin, which is the molecule in your red blood cells that transports oxygen to your tissues. That comes from animals. And non-heme iron comes from plants. So heme iron, as it is, can be absorbed by your intestinal cells. Nothing really needs to be done. It's absorbed very easily. Non-heme iron, most of which is in the form of ferric iron, needs to be converted into a different form called ferrous iron. So in plants, the predominant form of iron that we eat is ferric iron, but we can't really absorb that super great. So we need something to convert it to ferrous iron for us to be able to absorb that into our bloodstream. So what do we need to do that converting? What's one thing that does that? Vitamin C. So the practical takeaway here is that if you feed your baby an iron-rich plant-based food, you also want to feed them a vitamin C-rich food at the same meal for the iron to be absorbed. It doesn't work if you feed them the vitamin C at dinner and they ate iron at breakfast. They need to be fed at the same time. So some awesome sources of vitamin C include bell peppers, kiwis, tomatoes, strawberries, cantaloupe, grapefruit, broccoli, asparagus, oranges, papaya, cauliflower, and lemon. So I'm going to give you a second mini biochemistry lesson here. There's 3 total. Vitamin C can be damaged by the heat. And so cooking these vitamin C rich foods that I just listed renders them a lot lower in vitamin C than serving them raw. But a lot of these foods are not safe to serve to baby raw. So offering things like sliced kiwi, oranges or grapefruit without the membrane, pureed strawberries, soft cantaloupe slices, or squeezing lemon on steamed broccoli are all great ways to maximize your baby's intake of vitamin C from these foods. So mini biochemistry lesson number 3 here. Iron and calcium. Now remember I mentioned that I didn't list any dairy or milk products as high iron sources in the iron animal-based foods list that I talked about. And that's because iron and calcium, they're both absorbed by the same transporter in your small intestine. So if you serve baby a meal that is super high in calcium, at the same time you also give them a meal that's super high in iron, the calcium is going to compete with the iron for absorption because there's only one transporter for both of those minerals, and less iron is going to be absorbed. So this really usually only comes into play if someone's feeding their baby like cheese and yogurt at every single meal, or if in toddlerhood the kiddo is drinking a ton of cow's milk. So keep this in mind if you're your doctor concerned about your baby's iron intake. Now, serving one iron-rich meal per day without any high calcium foods or any high calcium dairy products at that same time can usually minimize the risk for calcium interfering with iron absorption. Now, you might notice that many of the foods on this list provide you with 3 or more super essential nutrients for babies. That is protein, iron, and zinc. And that's because many animal products, nuts, and seeds are great sources of all 3 of these essential nutrients. So try to offer iron and zinc rich food at each meal, but don't stress if you can't squeeze it in every single time. And if you're offering your baby high protein foods, oftentimes high iron or zinc is going to accompany that, but not all the time, like in the case of some fish, for example. So, do babies following a baby-led weaning style approach have trouble with iron and zinc? This is a question that's asked by a lot of pediatricians because sometimes babies appear to be eating less food if they're following a baby-led weaning style approach. So the research so far tells us that no, babies following a baby-led weaning approach that emphasizes foods rich in iron and zinc, as well as safety and variety, and a baby-led feeding approach, so listening to baby's cues. These little guys do not have lower intakes of iron and zinc, and they are not at risk of having a low iron blood level, more so than babies in a control group. So the takeaway here is variety is key. We define baby's diet variety not necessarily at each meal, but rather at each day or each week at a time. So give them safe foods rich in iron and zinc. Emphasize the vitamin C rich foods when providing providing plant foods that are rich in iron, and overall, again, focus on your baby's overall diet variety.